Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen, not in a good way. She wasn't the kind of person who waved hello over the fence or baked cookies for new neighbors. She was the self-appointed sheriff of the cul-de-sac, the queen of rules nobody had asked for, and I had unknowingly stepped into her crosshairs the moment I moved in. I still remember the first time she appeared at my doorstep. I had been hauling boxes up 3 flights of stairs, sweating, exhausted, the sun baking my shoulders. She stood there, perfectly poised in her pastel cardigan, a clipboard in hand, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You realize you're not supposed to do that," she said, pointing vaguely at the side yard. My brain froze. "Do what?" I asked, trying to hide the annoyance that curled in my chest. "You know," she said, that sharp edge in her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "Live outside the HOA rules, that deck, that paint, that lifestyle." And just like that, the invisible walls of my own home felt constricting. I had bought my dream house, poured my savings into every corner, imagined weekends of quiet reading on the porch, and suddenly it felt like a trap. The first week was a haze. Every day I found another note tucked under the mailbox, slid through the door, or worse, left hanging on my fence. Each one carefully typed, each one dripping with that peculiar mixture of righteousness and personal vendetta. "This is a violation," one read. "You are causing the neighborhood distress," said another. I tried to laugh it off at first. I told myself she's just particular. But deep down, a knot was forming in my stomach, a quiet, persistent fear that no one else saw. Then came the email. Karen had escalated faster than anyone I had ever met. She claimed I was living illegally outside the HOA's authority. There were threats of fines, citations, even the possibility of court. I read the words, my hands trembling slightly, thinking, court? For living in my own house? It was absurd. It was terrifying. It was somehow personal. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and preparation. I watched my neighbors, wondering if they even noticed the chaos erupting quietly next door. Most didn't. Some avoided me entirely, casting subtle glances as if I had a contagious disease. But one neighbor, old Mr., leaned over the fence one evening, shaking his head with a wry smile. "You've got spirit," he said. "Most would have packed and left by now." I wanted to laugh, but instead I nodded silently, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. Nightfall brought no relief. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. Every shadow against the curtains felt like eyes peering in, judging, waiting. I lay awake, thinking of Karen's words, her clipped smile, her relentless certainty that she alone had the right to dictate how people lived. And then the doubt crept in. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she was right. Maybe my dream home was nothing more than a ticking time bomb of judgment. And yet somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the gnawing anxiety, a small ember of defiance burned. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the simple truth that no one had the right to tell me I didn't belong in my own home. I began to make notes, organize papers, photograph every corner of my property. Evidence. If this was going to escalate, I wasn't going down quietly. By the 3rd day, the letters had stopped. Instead, there was a summons, a court date. My stomach sank. I read it again and again, each word heavier than the last. "You are hereby required to appear." The ink seemed to burn, and yet as fear tightened its grip, so did determination. I realized then that this wasn't just about my house. It wasn't about HOA rules, fines, or paint colors. It was about dignity. About standing for yourself when the world, or one overbearing neighbor, decides you don't belong. The night before court, I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes, my notes, my camera evidence, feeling like a soldier preparing for battle. I didn't know what the morning would bring. I didn't know if I would be humiliated, fined, or worse. But I did know one thing: I wasn't going to be broken. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the image of Karen's perfect smile, the clipboard clutched in her hands, her eyes filled with that cold certainty. I vowed silently, come morning, she would learn that some things can't be owned, controlled, or dictated by fear alone. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. I had never been inside a place like this before, where whispers carried weight and every glance could feel like judgment. My hands were clammy, my notes clutched so tightly they crumpled slightly in my grip. I wondered briefly if anyone else had ever felt this small in a room full of strangers, and then I saw her. Karen, sitting in the front row like she owned the world. Her posture was immaculate, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, those eyes were sharp, predatory, calculating. I swear, for a moment, she looked straight through me like she could see every flaw, every fear, every doubt hidden behind my calm exterior. And I wanted to look away. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The judge called the room to order, and suddenly the air thickened with tension. Papers shuffled, murmurs faded. All that remained was the raw, heavy quiet of anticipation. And then Karen spoke. She presented her case with a kind of precision and confidence that made my chest tighten. She described my violations in cold, clinical detail, each word crafted to make me seem reckless, careless, almost criminal. I listened, trying to focus, but every time she paused, I felt the weight of her gaze like a hand pressing against my chest. And the truth, she had convinced some of the people in the room that this wasn't about a house, it was about me. My choices, my right to live the way I wanted. I swallowed hard. The fear clawed at me, sharp and real. I wondered if I had underestimated her, if I had stepped into a battle I wasn't ready for. Then came my turn. I took a deep breath and stood. Every muscle in my body was tense, every nerve screaming that I should flee. But I forced myself to speak slowly, carefully, letting each word land with intention. I described my home, my work, my life. I spoke about the hours spent transforming a house into a home, about the quiet joy of watching sunlight spill across my porch in the morning. I spoke about respect, about boundaries, about living peacefully alongside neighbors. And yes, I spoke about fear, about the anxiety of feeling judged, scrutinized, threatened in my own space. As I spoke, I noticed something shift in the courtroom. Some people leaned in, nodding slightly. Others whispered, exchanging glances that were softer, more understanding. And Karen, she didn't flinch. She didn't change expression. But I saw, just for a second, a flicker of irritation cross her face, a crack in her otherwise unshakable armor. The back and forth continued. Evidence was presented, witnesses called. I had prepared meticulously, knowing that every note, every photograph, every email could be the difference between humiliation and vindication. And still, the tension never eased. Every passing minute felt like a stretch of rope, fraying with the weight of expectation. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling as I adjusted my papers for the 5th time. Then the turning point came. Karen, confident as ever, leaned on one of her points, an interpretation of the HOA's bylaws that was supposed to be airtight. She smiled, expecting triumph, but my lawyer, calm and unflappable, rose and countered with evidence she hadn't anticipated. Documents, letters, precedents. Every detail carefully lined up, shining a light on the truth. I had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. I watched Karen's expression change in slow motion. First, confusion, then tension. Then the barely contained fury of someone realizing that control was slipping through her fingers. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge's pen paused mid-note, the air thick with anticipation. I felt my own heart start to calm, replaced by something strange and powerful, hope. Real, stubborn hope. By the time the hearing ended, the ruling hadn't even been announced yet. But I knew, deep down, that something fundamental had shifted. Karen's confidence was shaken. The narrative she had tried to control for so long was unraveling. And I was standing taller than I had in days. When the judge finally spoke, the words were simple, clear, vindicating. I had been right all along. Karen's claims were dismissed. My rights were upheld. The courtroom exhaled with me. Relief washed over me like a wave, strong and overwhelming. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and for a moment I allowed myself to surrender to the raw, unfiltered joy of being recognized as deserving, as lawful, as human. And yet, even in victory, there was a quiet lesson. I realized that courage isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about showing up, about speaking your truth, even when fear presses against your chest like a weight you can't shake. Sometimes it's about standing alone in a room that seems determined to see you fail, and trusting that what is right is stronger than intimidation. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt the weight of the ordeal lift, replaced by a quiet pride. I glanced over at Karen one last time. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger, the perfect reminder that control is always fleeting. And as I stepped into the sunlight outside, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had survived, I had fought, and I had won. Not just for myself, but for the invisible dignity that every person deserves in the sanctuary of their own home. The moment I stepped back into my neighborhood, everything felt different. The sidewalks, the trees, the familiar hum of cars passing, it all seemed sharper, almost alive. I should have felt relief. I should have felt victory. But instead there was a quiet tension underneath it all, the kind that you can't see but can somehow feel in the air. Corinne wasn't finished. I could feel it, a ripple in the way neighbors looked at me, a hushed whispering that reminded me that battles sometimes leave invisible scars. That evening, as I unpacked the last of my boxes, the memory of the courtroom replayed over and over in my mind. Every second, every pause, every subtle glance from Corinne. The intensity of it stayed with me, a low hum under my skin. And then I noticed something, my mailbox, another note, crisp, typed, deliberate. My hands shook as I opened it. It was shorter this time, direct, sharp. You may have won the court case, but the neighborhood has rules. We will be watching. I froze. My first instinct was to tear it up, throw it in the trash, pretend it didn't exist. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about legality anymore. It wasn't about bylaws, fines, or paint colors. It was about human nature. The stubborn need some people have to control what they cannot. Corinne had lost the courtroom battle, but she hadn't lost her war of influence, her war of fear. And that realization hit harder than any legal victory ever could. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside my window felt. I imagined her eyes peering over fences, her clipboard in hand, scanning for any misstep. And yet beneath the fear, a quiet determination had begun to grow. I realized that winning a court case was just one step. Living freely, peacefully, fully was another. And for the first time, I truly understood that courage wasn't just about confrontation, it was about endurance. The next morning, I walked through the neighborhood with a heightened awareness, noticing subtleties I had ignored before. Neighbors whose expressions had been neutral now seemed cautiously approving, while others, perhaps silently loyal to Corinne, kept their distance. The air felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for the next move in a game they hadn't asked to play. And then I saw it, Corinne, pruning her roses with surgical precision, glancing up as I passed. Her smile was tight, controlled. There was no warmth in it, only calculation. She didn't speak, didn't wave, but I felt the weight of her gaze like a presence following me down the street. I tried to focus on my life, on normalcy, on routines that had been disrupted by weeks of tension and anxiety. I painted a wall in the living room, baked a loaf of bread, watered my plants. And yet every small act of peace was accompanied by an undercurrent of vigilance. The freedom I had fought for in court was real, but freedom, I realized, isn't always a gift you simply claim. Sometimes it's a practice you must cultivate daily against forces you can't always see. Then came the first truly quiet moment of reflection. Sitting on my porch, watching sunlight spill across the lawn, I let myself think about the absurdity of the whole ordeal. How one person could try to dominate the lives of dozens, all because of fear, pride, or a misplaced sense of ownership. And I understood something fundamental. Control is an illusion. Dignity is not. The victory in court mattered, but it was the everyday choices, the refusal to shrink, the insistence on living authentically that truly defined me. Days turned into a week. Corinne's presence lingered like a shadow, but I started noticing cracks. She became more erratic, more precise in her attempts to intimidate, almost desperate. I caught snippets of conversations with other neighbors, saw her packing late at night. And strangely, that desperation brought clarity. It revealed the truth I had known all along. Fear makes people cruel, and cruelty can be outlasted. Patience, consistency, and courage, these were the tools that truly mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat with a cup of tea and watched my garden. The warm colors of sunset painted the sky, illuminating the house I had fought so hard to protect. I realized that this home wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was a testament to resilience, a proof of survival, and a sanctuary for the life I chose to live. Corinne could challenge rules, intimidate neighbors, even file lawsuits, but she couldn't touch that. She could try, but she couldn't take what I had built in my heart. And as night fell, I let out a long breath, a quiet exhale that carried months of tension, fear, and doubt. I had faced judgment, intimidation, and doubt, not just from her, but from myself, and I had come through. Stronger, wiser, more aware of the fragile balance between fear and courage, control and freedom. I knew that this was only one chapter in a long story. Corinne's shadow might linger and challenges might arise again. But I also knew something else. The true victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in choosing to stand tall, even when the world tried to bend me. The day started like any other, but I knew it wouldn't end that way. There's a certain quiet before chaos, a tension in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible. I felt it the moment I stepped outside. The streets were calm, the sun warm, but my instincts screamed caution. Karen's presence had changed. She was no longer just watchful, she was relentless, like a storm gathering energy in the distance, poised to strike. It began with subtle things. Notes slipped under my door with sharper, more cutting language. Complaints filed with neighbors, whispered warnings in hushed tones, fingers pointed in my direction when I walked by. It was no longer about rules. It was about control. About her need to dominate a space she had already lost legally but refused to lose in spirit. And the more she tried, the more I realized how deeply fear can twist a person, turn vigilance into obsession. One evening I returned from work to find my garden vandalized. Flowers uprooted, mulch scattered, footprints pressed into the soft earth. My stomach sank. My sanctuary, my safe haven, had been violated. I wanted to scream, to confront, to throw my hands up in frustration. But instead I paused, breathing slowly, grounding myself. This wasn't about retaliation. This was about protecting what was mine, without letting fear take root. The following days were a test of endurance. I documented everything meticulously, photographs, notes, timestamps. I spoke calmly to neighbors who seemed sympathetic, gathering witnesses, creating a web of support I hadn't realized I needed until now. And through it all, I kept my composure, not because I was fearless, but because I refused to hand over my power to someone else's obsession. Karen might try to control the narrative, but she couldn't control me. It was during one particularly tense afternoon that I saw her standing across the street, peering through my window as if she could see my thoughts. I wanted to confront her, to yell, to assert my victory, but something held me back. Instead, I returned her gaze steadily, unflinching, as though to say, "I see you. I know what you're doing, and I will not bend." That silent exchange, brief as it was, became a turning point. I realized that courage isn't loud. It doesn't always need to be dramatic. Sometimes, it's simply standing firm while the world tries to shake you. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle, replaying every interaction, every subtle threat, every silent judgment. And I thought about how fear can make people cruel, how obsession can twist logic into justification, how power can feel like the only thing keeping someone alive in their own mind. Karen wasn't evil in the cinematic sense, she was terrified, and that terror had manifested as control, as cruelty, as relentless pursuit. Understanding that didn't make her actions any less harmful, but it made them human. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began to speak more openly. A wave of quiet support started to form around me, subtle but undeniable. People admired my resilience, my composure, my refusal to let intimidation dictate my life. And yet, even with this support, the tension never fully lifted. Karen's shadow lingered, a constant reminder that victory in a single battle does not end the war. One afternoon, while tending my garden, I realized that the real work wasn't legal. It wasn't documentation. It wasn't even confrontation. It was emotional. It was the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust in myself, of faith in my own right to exist peacefully in the space I had created. It was learning to occupy my life fully, unapologetically, without letting fear dictate every decision. Karen could try to intimidate me. She could plant seeds of doubt. But she could not take my sense of self. The lessons became clear in quiet moments. The strength of patience, the power of resilience, the courage it takes to remain calm while chaos swirls around you. I found peace not in defeating Karen outright, but in refusing to be defeated by her. The realization was liberating, almost intoxicating. There was a power in serenity, in deliberate action, in the refusal to let fear dictate your life. And yet the story was far from over. I could feel it in the way Karen's eyes followed me, in the meticulousness of her notes, in the subtle escalation of her tactics. The war wasn't about legality anymore. It was personal. And while I had learned to navigate her obsession with strength and dignity, I knew the next phase would test me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across my yard, I sat on the porch, a quiet satisfaction in my chest. I had survived the court. I had faced intimidation, fear, and doubt, and I had emerged not just victorious but stronger. The road ahead was uncertain, the shadows longer, the challenges more subtle. But I knew one unshakable truth: my home, my dignity, my life were mine. And no obsession, no lawsuit, no fear could ever take that away. The morning started like any other, yet the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. I sensed it before I even stepped outside. Karen was planning something, and this time it felt different. Desperation clings to people in ways that fear never could, twisting logic into obsession, sharpening every thought into a weapon. I braced myself, knowing that whatever came next, I had to stay calm. I had learned by now that fear was the enemy, clarity my only ally. It began subtly. A flyer tucked into my mailbox, neatly folded, its words polite but pointed. Neighborhood standards matter, compliance is essential. I read it twice, feeling that old knot in my stomach, but this time I didn't crumble. Instead, I set it aside, taking a deep breath. Karen was escalating, but she wasn't unstoppable. I had survived intimidation, lawsuits, even covert harassment. I could survive this too. By mid-morning, whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. Karen had apparently a few residents to her side, murmuring about the rogue neighbor who refused to follow the rules. But something curious happened. The neighbors she expected to support her hesitated. Maybe they remembered the court case. Maybe they had seen the way I had handled her previous tactics. Or maybe, deep down, people respect courage even when it's quiet. Whatever it was, her influence seemed to wobble for the first time since this ordeal began. Late that afternoon, she appeared at my door. Not a note, not a whisper, her full presence, clipboard in hand, perfectly rehearsed smile plastered across her face. We need to talk about compliance, she said, voice steady but eyes betraying a flicker of impatience. I invited her in. A dangerous move, perhaps. But I had learned over the past weeks that strength isn't always about confrontation, it's about control. Control of yourself, control of the narrative, control of the fear she hoped to plant. We talked, or rather she talked, while I listened. Every complaint, every rule, every imagined infraction carefully recited as though repetition could manufacture truth. And then, as she paused for effect, I said something quiet but deliberate. I've followed the rules, I've respected the neighborhood, and I've lived my life peacefully. That's all anyone can ask. I watched her eyes narrow. She expected fear, outrage, maybe tears. Instead, she found calm. She found certainty. She found resistance. That night, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that Karen's obsession was powered by one thing, my reaction. Fear fed her tactics, uncertainty fueled her attacks, and the moment I refused to yield, the moment I asserted my right to exist on my own terms, her power began to diminish. I didn't need to argue endlessly or retaliate with aggression. I simply had to stand firm, consistent, and unshakable. That was my advantage, and it was one she couldn't take from me. Over the following days, the harassment continued, but I approached it differently. Every note, every whisper, every attempt to undermine me was met with calm documentation, quiet assertiveness, and strategic clarity. I photographed incidents, spoke with neighbors, even drafted a letter reinforcing my compliance with all HOA rules. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about demonstrating that intimidation only works if you allow it to. My life, my home, and my peace were non-negotiable. And then came the subtle victories. Neighbors who had been silent allies began speaking up. Casual conversations turned into support networks. Small gestures, a nod, a smile, a casual comment about fairness became a shield against Karen's attempts to isolate me. I realized something profound. Resilience isn't always a solo act. Sometimes it's the ripple effect of courage, quiet and persistent, inspiring others to stand alongside you. By the end of that week, Karen's energy shifted. Her relentless attacks became scattered, erratic, almost frantic. She attempted one final meeting with the HOA board, hoping to leverage her influence, but the tide had turned. Her allies hesitated, the board was informed, and my documentation was irrefutable. She was losing control, not because I had fought harder, but because I had remained unflinching, strategic, and calm. That evening, as I stood on my porch watching the sunset, I felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with profound satisfaction. The ordeal was not just about legal victories or compliance. It was about integrity, courage, and patience. I had been tested relentlessly, but I had endured. And in enduring, I had reclaimed more than my home. I had reclaimed my sense of self, my dignity, and my quiet authority over my own life. And somewhere in the shadows, I knew Karen was learning a truth she could never accept fully. Control is fleeting. Fear is fragile. Power belongs not to the loudest, the most meticulous, or the most vindictive, but to those who remain steadfast, calm, and courageous when chaos threatens to overwhelm them. I had lived that lesson, and now, finally, it was undeniable. The morning sunlight fell across my yard, warm and unthreatening, but my nerves refused to settle. I sensed the storm before it arrived. Karen's presence had shifted from methodical to desperate. You could almost see the tension coiling in her movements, the way she carried herself like a predator who had just realized her prey wouldn't run. And for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt anticipation, quiet and steady. Her latest attempt was audacious. She had called an emergency HOA meeting, supposedly to discuss community compliance, but I knew it was another chance for her to assert dominance, to manufacture fear, to draw attention to my life as if it were a spectacle. The meeting hall smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy. Neighbors whispered in corners, casting furtive glances. Corinne stood at the front, confident as ever, but I could see the tension in her hands. The veneer of control was cracking. As the meeting began, Corinne launched into her usual monologue, lists, complaints, accusations. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered repeatedly toward me, searching for a reaction. She expected panic, indignation, hesitation. But I stayed calm, letting her words wash over me without resistance. My calm was deliberate. It was a quiet form of defiance she could not anticipate, and it made her increasingly unsettled. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't defend myself aggressively. I didn't argue or plead. I simply laid out the facts, every detail of compliance, every record of interaction, every email and photograph meticulously documented. I spoke clearly, without hesitation, and most importantly, without fear. Each sentence landed like a stone, solid and undeniable. Slowly, the room began to shift. Whispers of doubt started to ripple through the audience. Corinne's allies, who had once nodded confidently, now exchanged uncertain glances. It was in that moment that I realized the true power wasn't in shouting louder, filing more complaints, or intimidating neighbors. It was in consistency, in integrity, in the quiet, relentless assertion of truth. Corinne had been fighting a battle she could not win because her power was built on fear, not fact, not fairness. And when confronted with unshakable calm and undeniable evidence, fear falters. It crumbles. Corinne's frustration became palpable. Her voice rose slightly, trembling as she tried to maintain authority. But the room had already begun to see the truth. Her narrative was unraveling, and then in a moment of poetic justice, a neighbor she had leaned on for support spoke up. Calmly, firmly, they confirmed everything I had said. Their voice carried weight because it was sincere, because it was unflinching. Corinne's influence began to collapse like a house of cards. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was clear even before the formal vote. Corinne's attempts to manipulate, intimidate, and control had failed. Not because I had fought harder, but because I had refused to be shaken. Every calculated attack she made, every whispered accusation, every desperate attempt to assert dominance had only highlighted her obsession and insecurity. She had underestimated the quiet power of resilience. Walking home afterward, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The tension that had lingered like a shadow for weeks, months, began to dissipate. It wasn't just about winning a battle with Corinne. It was about reclaiming space, reclaiming peace, reclaiming the dignity that fear had tried to strip away. Every step felt lighter, every breath fuller. I realized that what I had endured was more than a conflict with a neighbor. It was a trial of patience, courage, and self-respect. That evening, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The neighborhood was quiet. For the first time in weeks, there was no whispering, no covert surveillance, no undercurrent of tension. And in that quiet, I understood something profound. Control over others is temporary, fragile, and ultimately meaningless when it's rooted in fear. True strength, true power, comes from the steady assertion of self, from acting with integrity, from refusing to let chaos dictate your life. I thought about Corinne, packing in her house, frustrated and defeated. Her obsession with control finally met with the impenetrable wall of my calm and preparation. And though part of me felt a twinge of sympathy, because fear can make people cruel, I also felt the full measure of satisfaction. Justice, in its quietest form, had been served. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. As night fell, I sipped my tea and allowed myself to reflect on the journey. Every note, every threat, every moment of anxiety had been part of a larger lesson. I had learned to endure, to observe, to act with precision and patience. I had learned that courage is not always visible. Often, it is the quiet act of standing firm when the world expects you to break. And above all, I had learned that freedom, true freedom, is claimed not in moments of confrontation alone, but in the daily choice to live unshaken, unapologetic, and authentic. The days that followed Corinne's final failed attempt felt surreal. The neighborhood, once a landscape of whispered tension and sideways glances, seemed to breathe differently. People smiled without hesitation, waved without pause, and treated me not as an anomaly to be watched, but as a neighbor to be respected. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but it carried a weight that filled me with quiet relief. I walked down the streets with a new awareness. Every detail of the neighborhood seemed brighter, sharper, alive with small acts of kindness that had been overshadowed by fear. Children played without interference, dogs barked without scrutiny, and neighbors lingered on their porches, relaxed and open. And yet beneath that calm, I noticed something even more profound, a change in myself. I was no longer constantly scanning for threats. The knot in my stomach had loosened, replaced by a steady, quiet confidence I hadn't realized I was capable of feeling. Karen didn't disappear entirely, of course. She still moved about the neighborhood, tending her yard, organizing her meetings, occasionally glancing in my direction. But the aura of control she had wielded so fiercely for months had dissipated. The shadow she had cast over my life was shrinking, becoming less intimidating with each passing day. I watched her one afternoon, carefully clipping roses, a faint tension in her shoulders. And for the first time, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of triumph. Not gloating, not vindictive, just recognition that persistence, integrity, and calm could outlast obsession. Neighbors began sharing small stories with me, quietly recounting moments when Karen had tried to sway them, only to be met with polite refusal or inner hesitation. These were the subtle victories that mattered most. Each one was a reminder that influence built on fear is fragile, and that people, even when intimidated, often respond to truth and resilience more than to threats or manipulation. I realized that the courtroom battle had been only the beginning. The real change happened in these quiet, almost invisible shifts, where fear lost its grip and human dignity began to reclaim space. One evening, as I prepared dinner, a neighbor knocked on my door. She was an older woman, someone I had seen occasionally but never spoken to at length. "I just wanted to say I admire how you handled everything," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Most people would have folded under the pressure. You didn't just fight for yourself, you reminded all of us what fairness looks like." I felt a lump rise in my throat. For months, I had been caught between fear and determination, unsure if anyone else understood the stakes. Her words, simple as they were, confirmed that endurance, dignity, and courage ripple outward, affecting more lives than you might ever realize. As the days stretched into weeks, I began to rebuild routines disrupted by months of tension. Mornings felt lighter. I drank coffee on the porch, unbothered by the once constant sensation of being watched. I painted, cleaned, and organized without the creeping sense of judgment. The neighborhood had shifted, but so had I. I had grown stronger, more aware of my own boundaries, more confident in my right to live freely in my own space. The fear that had once loomed like a shadow had become a memory, a reminder of what I had overcome. Reflecting on the ordeal, I realized that it wasn't just about Karen or the HOA. It was about the human experience of facing intimidation and choosing integrity over fear, patience over reaction, truth over manipulation. It was about understanding that courage doesn't always roar. It often whispers, persistent and steady, demanding nothing but acknowledgement and self-respect. I felt pride not in the legal victories, but in the subtle reclamation of my life, my space, and my peace. One evening I walked past Karen's house. She was trimming her hedges, focused and meticulous, but her movements lacked the intensity they once held. It was a small detail, but I noticed it immediately. Control, I realized, can be fleeting. Power built on fear is temporary, and while her presence lingered, the tension she once wielded so effectively was gone. The landscape of our lives, both her own and mine, had shifted irrevocably. As night fell, I sat on my porch, gazing at the stars above. The quiet of the neighborhood mirrored a quiet within me. I had survived a gauntlet of fear, judgment, and obsession, and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more aware of the fragile balance between control and freedom. The lesson was clear. True victory is not in domination, not in force, not in winning battles. It is in maintaining integrity, patience, and courage when the world expects you to falter. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting long golden streaks across lawns and rooftops, and for the first time in months I felt entirely at peace. The tension that had hung over my life like a heavy fog had lifted, replaced by something far more profound, clarity, resilience, and a deep understanding of what it truly means to protect one's life and dignity. Karen's shadow was still there, lingering like a reminder of the struggle, but it no longer had power over me. I thought back to the day I first moved in, the excitement, the hope, the sense that a home is simply a place to live. That hope had been tested, stretched, and at times threatened to break. But I had survived, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through persistence, patience, and calm assertion of my rights. And in doing so, I had learned a lesson that no court, no lawsuit, and no neighbor could ever take away. Courage is quiet, dignity is personal, and freedom is earned every day. The neighborhood had changed too. People moved a little differently, spoke a little differently. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense of balance restored. Small gestures of kindness, moments of acknowledgement from neighbors, smiles that weren't forced. They all reflected the unspoken understanding that fairness and resilience matter more than fear or intimidation. It was a quiet victory, but one that resonated far deeper than any legal ruling. I watched Karen one afternoon, pruning her roses with her meticulous care. There was still tension in her shoulders, a tightness in her smile, but it was no longer directed at me with the same intensity. She had lost her grip not just on me, but on the narrative she had tried so hard to control. And in that loss, I found a subtle, almost surreal sense of closure. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in her defeat. I simply acknowledged that perseverance, truth, and patience had their own kind of power, one that no obsession, no intimidation could overturn. Walking through the neighborhood, I noticed the little things I had missed before. The way sunlight glinted off leaves, the laughter of children playing without worry, the gentle greetings of neighbors who had once been silent. It struck me how often life is overshadowed by fear, by small tyrannies that seem insurmountable until someone quietly refuses to yield. That refusal doesn't always make headlines. It doesn't always feel grandiose, but it changes everything. It reshapes the environment around you, and more importantly, it reshapes you. Sitting on my porch that evening, I allowed myself to reflect fully on the journey. The fear, the sleepless nights, the subtle harassment, the courtroom tension, all of it had been a crucible, and from that crucible, something unshakable had emerged. I realized that resilience isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about meeting it with unwavering integrity. Courage isn't about anger or force. It's about choosing to stand firm when intimidation and fear are expected to sway you. And dignity isn't something you earn from others. It's something you claim for yourself, quietly, consistently, and without compromise. I thought about the weeks I had spent preparing, documenting, strategizing, and waiting. Every small act of diligence, every patient response, every calm refusal to be shaken had accumulated into something far greater than a single victory. It had become a testament to self-respect, to perseverance, and to the subtle yet unstoppable power of living according to your own principles. And in that realization, I felt a sense of completeness, a quiet triumph that could not be diminished by lawsuits, accusations, or the lingering presence of someone like Karen. As night fell, the neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of porch lights and street lamps. I felt an almost sacred peace. I had faced fear and manipulation head-on and emerged intact. I had defended my home, my choices, and my dignity without sacrificing calm, integrity, or humanity. And in doing so, I had proven to myself, and perhaps to anyone paying attention, that the most enduring victories are often invisible, subtle, and rooted in the quiet assertion of who we are and what we will not compromise. I stood and looked at my house, the home I had fought for, the sanctuary I had protected, and a smile crept across my face. It wasn't a smile of triumph over someone else. It was the smile of someone who had survived, who had endured, and who had reclaimed their life. Karen's presence no longer mattered. The rules, the threats, the shadow of judgment, they all faded in the light of what I had earned: freedom, peace, and an unshakable sense of self. And as I sat back down, letting the quiet of the night settle around me, I realized something simple but profound. Sometimes the fiercest battles we fight are not with others, they are with fear itself. And the victories that matter most are the ones that allow us to breathe freely, to live fully, and to claim our place in the world without apology. That night under the stars and the soft hum of the neighborhood, I felt exactly that, whole, steadfast, and free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.